Welcome to my library of scary stories. My name is the Harvester, and today I will tell you another tale. The button I am holding in my hand is all that remains of the victims of today's story, but whose it is and who found it, you will find out shortly. So make yourselves comfortable, put on your headphones, and turn off the lights. Enjoy the listening. I can't take this to the police. Not because I'm afraid of the law. I'm afraid of what I would have to say out loud. Some things, once spoken, stop being thoughts and turn into a sentence for yourself. I thought for a long time about whether I should write this at all. I deleted the text several times, started over, stopped again. But there is a feeling that has kept me awake for many months now. And if I don't tell this to someone else, it will consume me. Slowly, quietly, just the way it likes to. I'm not making excuses, and I'm certainly not asking for sympathy. I just want to put on record a fact that won't change whether you believe me or not. So, I was the last person to hear them alive. After that realization, everything becomes different. Even the air in the room seems to grow thicker. I know how this sounds. I wouldn't have believed it myself if someone else had written it. But this is not a horror forum story, and not an attempt to scare anyone. This is my reality. I live an ordinary life in an ordinary American city. I work with my hands, pay my bills, and raise my son on my own. And all of this could have remained normal if, one day, I hadn't decided to ignore what I heard. They say silence is peace. After what happened, I know this. Sometimes silence is just a sign that it's already too late. If you do decide to listen to this story until the end, you will never again perceive silence and the faint noises within it the way you did before. In short, I'm an absolutely ordinary person. Not a hero, not a psycho, not the kind of guy they make Netflix documentaries about. There are thousands like me in this country. A man in his early 40s, hands constantly cracked from joint compound, a back that starts aching before noon. My work is repairs and finishing, drywall, paint, plaster, small remodels, the kind of work everyone calls unskilled until it starts falling down on their heads. I live in a small town in the Midwest. Everything here looks calm. Tidy houses, flags on porches, neighbors who say hello and never hold eye contact longer than necessary. But behind that picture are loans, a mortgage, and fear. Constant background fear of falling behind, of not making it, of getting sick at the wrong time. We have a house bought before interest rates started creeping up. A car that every fall begins to make strange rattling noises. Health insurance I pay for every month, but am still afraid to use, because what if it's not covered? I've learned to count, not money, but risks. I'm divorced. I have a son. He's 8. He loves building sets, asking strange questions about death and space, and every morning when I lace up my boots, he asks the same thing. Will you be home early today? I always say, yes, even when I know I'll be back after he's already asleep. I'm not saying it to him, I'm saying it to myself. My job is a constant balance between put up with it and lose everything. If you turn down a job, they'll find someone else. If you ask too many questions, you're labeled difficult. If you call any kind of authorities, your name gets remembered. Nobody asks why you're uncomfortable. They just stop calling. And I got used to staying quiet, taking extra side jobs in the evenings, sometimes on weekends, working while exhausted, nodding when something feels off, telling myself it's none of my business. Sometimes, coming home late at night, I caught myself thinking that my life had turned into a list of reasons why I wasn't allowed to stop. I wasn't allowed to lose my job. I wasn't allowed to be suspicious. I wasn't allowed to be the one who makes noise. Back then, I didn't know that this very habit, quietly doing my job and not meddling in things that weren't mine, would one day make me an accomplice, even if the law would never see me as one. That cursed job came in on Wednesday, closer to noon. A routine call from an unknown number, and the voice of a man who spoke evenly, without extra emotion, as if everything had already been decided and he was simply following instructions.
Do you do drywall and mudding?
Yes.
I need one room closed up. Nothing complicated. Just get it finished properly. How much will you charge?
I gave him a rough number, without seeing the place. Based only on the scope of work he described, he didn't even try to negotiate.
Fine. I'll pay half up front. Cash.
Cash isn't rare, but it always makes you a little wary, especially when the amount is larger than usual. I was about to ask where exactly the room was, the exact square footage, whether any prep had been done, but he added on his own.
It's downstairs, in the basement, a spare room. Used to be a playroom, I think. I want the walls to be even and quiet.
That word quiet struck me as odd at the time. Maybe he meant soundproofing. Maybe he just phrased it poorly. I pretended not to notice the implication because all that was going through my head at that moment was the size of the advance and the insurance payment coming up. The address was on the outskirts, one of those areas where houses sit far apart, and the streets get dark in the evening because the streetlights are either on a timer or simply never fixed. The man named a time and added one more condition, almost casually.
I want you to work in the evenings. After 6, it's more convenient for me.
Why not during the day? A pose. Too long for a simple question.
During the day, I'm busy, and I don't like people walking around the house. In the evenings, I'm barely there. You'll just do your job.
It sounded normal. People are different. Some are embarrassed by the mess, some don't trust contractors, some are just closed off. I'd seen thousands like that. He wasn't yelling, wasn't rude, wasn't applying pressure. He just spoke as if contact with people was something to be avoided. At the end, he said,
I'll give you a key. You'll come in, do the work, and leave. I don't want conversations or unnecessary questions. Deal?
I agreed, because one thought was ringing in my head. I couldn't afford to lose this job. On the first evening, I arrived a little before 6. The house looked like it had needed repairs for a long time, yet someone had carefully kept up its appearance. Fresh paint on the porch, a trimmed lawn, no scattered items or signs of daily life. Only one window on the first floor was lit. When I rang the doorbell, the door opened almost immediately. The man standing in front of me was exactly how I had imagined him. Thin, slightly hunched, wearing an old sweater that looked clean but worn. Without a word, he handed me the key and gestured toward the stairs leading down.
I'm leaving. If you need anything, text me. Don't call.
I stepped into the dim hallway, and the homeowner closed the door behind him. The basement greeted me with cool air. It was damp and heavy, with a strange smell, not rot, not mold, but something stale, as if things had been stored there for a long time that didn't belong there. I chalked it up to an old house and poor ventilation. Basements are always like that. The spare room was at the very end, small, windowless, with bare walls partially covered in drywall. I turned on the light, and at that moment, I heard a steady hum. The ventilation was running constantly, as if someone were afraid to turn it off even for a minute. The noise was monotonous, calming and irritating at the same time. I started tapping on the walls, checking where the studs were and where the hollow spaces should be, and that's when the strange feeling hit me for the first time. The emptiness wasn't where I expected it to be. Some sections sounded solid when there should have been space behind them. Others sounded too hollow, as if there was more behind the wall than just a basement. I stopped and listened. The ventilation hummed. Nothing else. No footsteps. No voices. I went back to work, forcing myself to think rationally. Old houses are always full of surprises, extra partitions, badly built niches, layers of one renovation over another. From time to time, it felt like the smell was getting stronger, but I blamed it on fatigue and fumes from the materials. The evening dragged on. My hands trembled from strain, my head buzzed. I caught myself working more slowly than usual, as if something were constantly distracting me. But every time I stopped and looked at the walls, they were just walls. Before leaving, I turned off the light and paused on the stairs for a second. In the darkness, the basement seemed larger than it really was. I took a deep breath, told myself it was just exhaustion, and closed the door. Back then, I still thought it was just the first shift, and that the sense of unease was nothing more than imagination. The next evening, I came back to the house without much hesitation. The anxiety from the first shift had dulled, that's how it always goes. What feels frightening at night seems trivial in daylight. I convinced myself I had simply been overtired, that the smell was old pipes, that the strange hum was just normal ventilation, that the walls, well, walls can be different. I went down to the basement again, turned on the light, and got back to work. The joint compound went on smoothly, my movements automatic. When you work with your hands long enough, your brain seems to shut off, leaving you alone with a monotonous background of sounds. The scrape of the putty knife, the hum of the ventilation, my own breathing. To make the process a little more bearable, I pulled out my old AirPods and slipped one into my ear. The monotony became easier, and a few minutes later, I heard it for the first time. Not clearly, not like a voice. More like a distorted sound barely breaking through the noise, as if someone had said something in the next room and you couldn't make out the words. I froze, holding the putty knife in midair, and listened.
Here.
I thought I heard. I tensed immediately. I took the earbud out. The ventilation sounded louder, as if someone had deliberately turned it up. I stood there for several seconds, feeling my heart start to race, but nothing happened. I exhaled and smiled to myself. A classic thing, acoustics, fatigue. The brain loves to fill in meaning where there is none. I even remembered how I once heard my name in the sound of the shower. Same thing. I kept working. A few minutes later, it happened again. Quieter, closer, as if the sound wasn't coming from the room, but from the wall itself, the one I was touching. This time I caught more of it. Not words, but the intonation. It was human, weak, broken.
Don't.
Something whispered. My hands went cold. I pressed the putty knife against the wall, feeling its chill. All it would have taken was one simple move, to knock, to crouch down, to check, to call out loud, anything. But instead, I thought about something else. About the advance payment, about the bills, about what would happen if I stopped right now and made a scene. If I stopped now, I'd lose the money. I forced myself to believe it was a hallucination, that if there really were someone alive in there, they would be screaming, banging, doing something obvious. I lowered my head, put both earbuds in, and kept working. Ignoring it turned out to be easier than I thought. That evening, I got home late. The house was quiet, too quiet for a family with a child. My son was already asleep, sprawled out with his arms over the blanket. I ate a few spoonfuls of yesterday's soup without even tasting it and sat in the dark living room, not turning on the lights. It felt like the sound of the ventilation was still ringing in my ears, monotonous, sticky. I caught myself listening to my own walls as if they might answer back. It was absurd. I knew that, but the thoughts wouldn't stop. I opened my laptop. Voices through walls, hearing things while tired. Basement ventilation noise, human voice. Google was quick to reassure me. Acoustic illusions, pareidolia, a brain searching for familiar patterns in chaos, especially under stress and exhaustion. I read this while taking sip after sip of whiskey I usually saved for weekends. The alcohol dulled the anxiety pleasantly, made my thoughts slower, less sharp. I remembered army training, night watch shifts, how, in the noise of wind and engines, it felt like someone was calling my name, how the brain supplies voices where there is only a hum. I remembered construction sites where pipes talk and walls creak as if something were living inside them. It all lined up. I told myself what I wanted to hear. If there really were someone alive in there, they would be screaming, hitting the wall, doing something so obvious I couldn't possibly ignore it. What I'd heard was too quiet, too uncertain, too much like a mistake. I finished the whiskey and peeked into my son's room. He was breathing softly, his fist clenched in his sleep, as if holding on to something important. There wasn't much left to finish on the job. One evening, two at most. I told myself I'd just finish the work and all of this would be behind me. As I fell asleep, I almost believed it. I came to my next shift with the feeling that I was doing something forbidden, though I couldn't clearly explain to myself what exactly it was. On the drive over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I kept telling myself it was from last night's alcohol and lack of sleep. I told myself, one evening, I'll finish it and that's it. I took the keys out of the mailbox where I'd left them the day before. I went into the now familiar house and headed toward the stairs. The basement was darker than before. The light flickered a few times before coming on, and in that brief moment of darkness, it felt like something moved. The smell hit immediately, thick, sweetish, almost sticky. Not just stale air. Something organic. I gagged and had to grab the railing to keep from falling. The ventilation was running at full blast. The air whistled through the vents as if someone were trying to swallow a scream. I walked into the room and touched the wall with my putty knife. The sound wasn't solid, and it wasn't hollow. It was damp. Wrong. I shuddered. Out of habit, I put my headphones on, and my brain slipped into the monotony of work. I don't know exactly how much time passed, but even through the music and the roar of the ventilation, I heard them. Not just noise. These were words. Children's words, broken, weak, spoken so close it felt like someone was standing on the other side of the wall.
Sir, it hurts.
A voice whispered. My stomach turned. I yanked out the earbuds. The putty knife slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. At that sound, the voices grew faster, more frightened, as if they were afraid I might leave.
We've been here a long time. It's dark. He said it had to be this way. Please don't close it.
I pressed my palms against the wall and jerked them back instantly. It was warm. Not construction site warm. Warm like a body. Cold sweat poured down my back. My teeth chattered so hard I thought they might crack. A sour taste filled my mouth, and I barely managed to turn away before vomiting onto the wall. I knew. In that moment, there was no room left for self-deception. There were children in there, alive, exhausted, and I was standing in front of them. And along with that realization came another image: police cars outside the house. My son asking why his dad was on the news, my ex-wife's accusations, child services, my job disappearing. A life that would never be normal again. I can't, I whispered, not knowing who I was speaking to. My hands wouldn't obey me, my vision swam, but I picked up the putty knife. With every movement, the voices grew weaker, as if they were spending their last strength. One of them whispered one more time.
Please.
I clenched my teeth and kept working. When I finished and turned off the light in the basement, a silence rang in my ears so loudly it was physically painful. That night, I could no longer say that I didn't know. I packed up my tools mechanically, without looking at the walls. I knew that if I looked one more time, I would break. As I was climbing the stairs out of the basement, the light on the first floor suddenly turned on. I flinched so hard I nearly dropped the toolbox. The homeowner was standing in the hallway. I hadn't heard him come back. No car, no door.
Are you finished already?
He asked calmly, as if we were talking about routine work. I nodded uncertainly. I tried not to look him in the eyes, but I could feel his gaze piercing, attentive, heavy. He walked past me in silence toward the basement stairs, stopped, listened. I held my breath, not even sure why. It felt like one more second and everything would collapse, but he only nodded, slowly, with satisfaction.
Good. It's much quieter down there now.
He turned back to me and added, almost casually, as if in passing,
They won't be making noise anymore.
My fingers went cold. In that moment, everything that had seemed strange snapped into a single straight line. Evening work away from prying eyes, the constant ventilation noise, the request not to ask questions, his absence from the house, his calm. I wanted to say something, anything, to ask who he meant, but not a single sound came out of my throat. He handed me the rest of the money, cash. I took it automatically, without counting. I could feel there was more than I was supposed to receive. Our fingers brushed for a second, and I felt how cold his were.
Thank you for the work. You're a good professional. Not everyone knows how to not hear things that shouldn't be heard.
When I stepped outside, it felt as if the house behind me exhaled. It was long past dark. The street was empty, and the silence around the house felt unnatural, as if it had been left there on purpose, just for me. At home, I moved on autopilot. I set the toolbox down in the hallway, took off my boots, trying not to look at the smears of joint compound on my pants. My son was asleep, so the house was quiet, normal, domestic quiet, the same kind of quiet I had still thought of as safe just yesterday. I sat down on the floor to sort my tools. I always did it the same way. Putty knives separate, the level against the wall, gloves into the side pocket of the box. When I shook them out, something small fell onto the floor and made a faint clicking sound. I didn't understand what it was right away. A small object, pink and blue, plastic, childish. I picked it up and held my breath. It was a button with a stylized star on it, slightly scratched, as if it had been worn for a long time. The kind sewn onto jackets or hoodies for kids no older than my son. I had no idea how it ended up in my things. I knew for a fact there had been no toys in the basement, no children's belongings. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, clutching the button between my fingers, feeling nausea rise in my throat. It felt warm, an absurd sensation of warmth, as if it had stuck to the tips of my fingers. I set the button on the shelf and went to wash my hands. I scrubbed them until they turned red, but the strange feeling of warmth wouldn't go away. The button stayed where I had put it, small, silent, undeniable. That was the first time I thought that some things are given to us as reminders of who we have become. A few days passed. I almost convinced myself that the worst was already behind me. I went to work, talked to people, laughed in the right places. The payment for the job made my life noticeably easier for a while. I threw the button away and tried not to think about it, as if it had just been a memory glitch, a misunderstanding, a waking dream. But everything changed on Saturday morning. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, scrolling through local news on my phone. As I scrolled down, I came across an article that made something inside me go cold. A photo of a familiar house, the same facade, the same lawn. The headline was dry, almost bureaucratic. Police discover children's bodies in basement of private home. Suspect arrested. I didn't open the article for several seconds. I just stared at the screen, feeling my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. When I finally tapped it, the world around me seemed to dull. The police had come after complaints from neighbors. The smell. They described it without emotion, strong, Swedish, suspicious. The article said the man was taken into custody without resistance, that he behaved calmly, too calmly. Then came the details that made my vision start to darken. In the basement, they found a false wall. Behind it, a narrow space sealed with spray foam and drywall. Inside, 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, all minors. I read and reread one paragraph over and over, as if it might change. According to medical examiners, the children did not die immediately. They remained alive for some time after the space was sealed. The cause of death was dehydration and lack of oxygen. I don't remember how I ended up in the bathroom. I was vomiting for a long time, violently, until there was nothing left. I stood there gripping the sink, and instead of the news article, I saw a wall. That same wall, fresh, smooth, and my own hands that had made it that way. At the end of the article, it mentioned that police were looking for everyone who had been in the house recently. Relatives, witnesses, contractors, anyone. I turned off my phone, because now reality had finally caught up with me. After that, life seemed to go on, but without me. I woke up, went to work, picked up my son from school, and did everything right. On the outside, inside, there was a constant feeling that I had missed something important, and that now it was already too late to go back. I barely slept. When I did fall asleep, I woke at the slightest sound. Our house suddenly became louder. Pipes clicked. Walls softly cracked at night. The kitchen ventilation made a steady, familiar hum, and every time I heard it, my stomach clenched. I caught myself freezing and listening not because I heard something, but because I was afraid I might. Sometimes it felt like someone was whispering, very quietly, so quietly I couldn't tell whether it was a sound or a thought. I would get up in the middle of the night, press my palms against the walls, put my ear to them. Cold, paint, emptiness. But the moment I stepped away, the silence became unbearable again. The smell didn't appear right away. At first I thought it was trash or dampness. Slightly sweet, barely noticeable. I checked everything, and then I opened my toolbox and saw the button. The same one. I was certain I had thrown it away that same cursed evening. It lay on top, as if someone wanted me to see it. The worst part was my son. He started waking up every night. He would just stand in the bedroom doorway, silently watching. When I called him, he'd come over and lie down next to me, but he wouldn't fall asleep for a long time. Once, almost in a whisper, he asked,
"Dad, it feels like there's someone in our walls. That's not true, right?"
I couldn't find an answer. I just held him and felt my hands shaking. A few weeks later, the police came. Officially, as part of the witness list. They asked calmly, took notes, thanked me for my cooperation. I told the truth. The part I could say out loud. I kept silent about the voices. My son was at school, and when the police left, the house became quiet again. Now I know for sure silence is not peace. It's the moment when there's no one left to scream. I go on living, but every time I touch a wall, I think about the irreversible thing I did. I've almost gotten used to living with constant tension, the way people live with chronic pain, not because it goes away, but because you get tired of reacting to it. That evening, I was putting my son to bed. He tossed and turned for a long time, muttering, asking about school, about whether we'd go somewhere in the summer. I sat beside him, listening to his breathing, counting the seconds between breaths. When he finally fell asleep, I was about to leave the room, but he suddenly opened his eyes.
Dad,
He said sleepily. "What is it, buddy?" He was quiet for a moment, as if trying to remember something important, and then softly, almost in a whisper, he said,
they talked like that too.
I froze. "Who is they?" I asked, feeling my fingers go cold. He frowned, as if I hadn't understood something obvious.
The ones in the wall. They asked us not to close it.
I didn't understand what my son was talking about. I didn't understand how he knew about the walls, or maybe he had just imagined it all. I don't remember what I answered. I don't remember how I left the room. I only remember standing in the hallway, staring at the wall across from me, feeling something inside my head slowly and finally come apart. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, I heard a sound, very quiet, so familiar that I had no doubt. Not words, not a voice, just a faint scratching, steady, careful, coming from the living room. I walked up to the wall and pressed my ear against it. My heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid it would drown out everything else. The sound came again, once, then a second time. I knew that if I grabbed a hammer and broke open the wall, it would all end. I would learn the truth, or I would finally break myself for good. I didn't do it. I stepped back, sat down on the floor, put my head in my hands, and waited for morning to come. The sounds didn't return. Now, as I write this, I understand one thing. I'm not unique. I'm not a monster, and I'm not a victim. I'm just a person who, at a certain moment, decided it was better to pretend you don't know than to lose your job, your peace, your normal life. But it turns out that kind of ignoring comes back to haunt you. I know that somewhere out there, reading this, you're thinking, I would never do that. I thought so too. Right up until the moment I heard something behind a wall and decided it wasn't my problem. So if one day you hear something strange, unclear, uncomfortable, something that's easier to ignore than to remember this story. Because the most terrifying thing in it isn't what happened to those children. It's that between them and salvation stood an ordinary person, someone who chose to ignore their suspicions, a person who can no longer live in peace, and for whom the noises and voices now live inside the walls of his home. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. I don't know what will happen to my son. I don't know whether the voices have truly appeared in my walls, or if my mind is dragging me back to that horrible evening. But what I fear most is that something like this will happen again, and not just to me. Well, if you enjoyed the story, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in the main character's place if you had heard voices coming from the basement? I also recommend checking out the previous story on my channel about a group of teenagers who discovered a secret underground laboratory and came face to face with the torture of their friends. Warning, This story is definitely not for the faint of heart.